It is finally time to make some rock sliders for my 80 series Land Cruiser, and in today's video we're going to show you exactly how I do it with a Harbor Freight tube bender, a flux core welder, a tube notcher, and some 120 wall 1 3/4 inch Dom tubing. There's tons of variations of rock sliders that are bolt on, but we're going to be welding these to the frame. Instead of just welding them straight to the frame, we're going to be using some 1/4 inch mounting plates configured in a diamond shape so that they add extra strength to the frame, as well as some gussets going out to the tubing. The 80 series frame bends a little bit as it goes towards the front, so it's a little difficult to mount them flush, but I'm going to show you the method that I've used on my previous Land Cruiser and pretty much the same method on this one so that you can tackle this project by yourself. The first thing we need to do is get our Dom tubing into the tube bender, make our bends for the kick out. What I'm doing is I'm taking 1 inch measurements, bending the pipe a few degrees, and then moving on to the next so it doesn't kink. There's going to be a little bit of kinking because this isn't a professional tube bender and it's not made for this application, but we're gonna make it work. You're into this for less than $1,000 and it's well worth the protection that you get from potentially hitting rocks and damaging your rocker panels. So without further ado, let's get into it. To start the kicker hoop, I put the Dom tubing inside the tube bender with the dies on the second lowest level, and then I've marked a center line so that I don't get bowing or have it unequal. You could get a level if you'd like. I've just been doing it by hand, and then I mark 1 inch dots so I know where I'm at, as well as a dot on the die itself. And then we use the hydraulic ram in order to start bending the tube. Now we'll start by giving 3 to 5 pumps on each 1 inch segment on the Dom tubing and moving on to the next. After we've given it 3 to 5 pumps, we'll release the tension on the hydraulic press, move the tubing to the next mark that I've made, keeping it center, and then go with another 3 to 5 pumps on the next section. I'm going to continue doing this until I've gotten the shape that I've wanted. It's not going to come out to 180 degrees, and we're going to need to cut or notch each side of the tubing so that it fits to the longer piece. Now that we've got the bend and angle that we want, we're going to compare it to the longer or the structural piece of the tubing. And I've measured 6 inches here and 23 inches here, which is the dimensions I want this kicker piece. This piece is profiled out wider so that it can kick you away from rocks, and then the other piece is going to tie in a little bit lower so that we're protected in the rear, and it'll actually kick the truck in the track so that it will kick us away from bigger rocks. Now what I'm going to do is mark with a paint pen on this angle, cut it, and then we're going to notch this tube so that it fits against the longer runner as smoothly as possible so that it makes welding really nice. This angle is a little too extreme, so we can't use the mounting plate for this chop saw, so I'm just going to hold it by hand, making sure that it's kind of close to level. Without using an angle finder and kind of just doing it by hand and by eye, I got it pretty darn close. The problem is we can't fit this piece in the tube notcher to make these fit really nicely because this tube notcher is maxed out at this angle and I can't get the right angle that I want with that hole saw. So we're going to put it in the vise and then grind it down with a flap disc. I've ground down all that I'm ready to grind down and begin welding this kicker part to the long runner. Remember, this is all just by hand with the flap disc because I can't use the tube notcher with the configuration that it has, so that's acceptable. We can start welding. So we fully welded this kicker piece to the long piece, and I know what you're thinking. Doesn't look pretty, but as far as the strength goes, this will be fine. We're gonna take a flap disc to a lot of this and clean up the rough edges and all that splatter. You can use anti-splatter material for flux core, but I just find that taking a flap disc makes it look better and cleans up all the rough edges. And again, I'm not too worried about the strength or the integrity of this piece, as I've made these before and had the weight of the truck resting on it. So we'll clean that up eventually. But now we need to get started on this piece, which will bend in to the front. So we've got our second piece bent into place and taken some measurements. So what we're looking for is 3 inches here and 3 inches here so that this is straight and level before the bend and right here, so that we'll have our supports go in the middle, and we've marked where we need to make a cut at an angle with our chop saw. So let's cut that up and then see where we're at. So we're gonna have to take the flap disc to this to get the contour that we want so that it mates up to this long piece. We'll take our measurement here, make sure that we're 3.5 inches, and then we'll make a paint pen mark here and cut at that angle, and then we can weld that piece in. So again, just kind of doing all this by eyeballing, not using an angle finder or really not even a measuring tape. I'm able to get a decent fitment. Of course, we're going to take the flap disc, grind that down to the profile. For example, this area right here needs to be ground down more and contoured to this piece of tubing, as well as this one. It just makes welding a lot cleaner, even though you could argue that these welds aren't very clean, but we're using flux core. We're doing this the cheapest way possible, saving some money and having a good time. So I've ground down enough material. I could sit here all day with the grinder and try and get it perfect, but also that's gonna contort the dimensions in which I originally cut this. So again, that's acceptable for the type of welds we're gonna be putting down, and we can fill it up with a flux core. Flux core is awesome for novices like myself because you can work with this. You don't have to be exactly perfect. There's going to be some professionals that are going to, you know, not think that this is acceptable, but again, this is for an 80 series Land Cruiser that's not my daily driver. I want to use it for off-road, and I really just want to protect these rocker panels, because if these get dented, then the doors don't open and close right, and it's really expensive to get a body shop to fix that. So let's go ahead and weld this up. So we've got this second hoop welded on. And again, we're just gonna wait until we're all finished and hit all this with the flap disc to get rid of all of these little speckles. But yeah, and again, it's not pretty. I'm not gonna overemphasize how ugly it is, but just like the classic saying goes, a grinder and paint for the welder that ain't. I've added some support pieces to the kicker and the main part of the slider. This is just additional 1 3/4 inch Dom tubing. The fitment wasn't perfect, and you're probably wondering how I was actually able to get them in there, and the answer is I notched this part here, notched that part, and then cut off the back end so that it would just fall into place, and then had to fill quite a bit of welding wire into the loose ends. So again, doesn't look pretty, but we're gonna hit all this with the flap disc when we're all finished with the mounting tubes to the frame. But for right now, I'm pretty happy with it. I think it looks pretty darn good. And we're gonna leave off the end caps, which we have from Barnes 4-wheel drive, because we use this as a ground. Makes it easier to ground too. But yeah, she's all finished. Now we need to look down on the frame side and see how we're going to mount these with the mounting plates. So I've just used 2 jack stands, one to hold the inner piece of tubing and one to create the angle that I want for deflection. I've got it nice and centered right below the pinch weld, and on the frame, I've made a few marks where the mounting plates are going to go. So now I need to take a flap disc and remove the paint from the areas that I've marked in order to put the mounting plates in the correct position. You notice that I've oriented them in a diamond pattern, and that's so that the frame doesn't contort and twist and bend when we've got the weight of the vehicle up on the sliders. We're also going to be adding some gussets for extra strength, but for right now we need to take the flap disc and grind away that paint. Now that we have the paint ground down off the area where we intend to put our mounting plates, we can go ahead and weld them on. We also ground off a little bit on this lower control arm mounting bracket in order to get a good ground for the welder. So let's put those up. We're just gonna hold them by hand, tack them, and then finish the welds. Now that we're welding on the frame, we definitely want to have our negative terminal on our battery disconnected so that we don't cause any electrical issues down the road, as well as our lithium charging dual battery setup that we have in the rear. Now that we've got these strengthening plates welded to the frame, it's time to put the sliders back up on the jack stand and start measuring for the pieces to tie into the sliders. Because the 80 series frame twists and it has several different bends, we're gonna have to take measurements of the angles to make sure we get it right. As you can see, this plate was mounted in just a square pattern because of the bend of the frame wouldn't allow it to mount flushly, and these were configured in the diamond pattern because the frame is a little bit straighter on these bends. So I've just by hand placed each support section going from the slider to the frame. I haven't welded it to the frame yet. Just tacked very lightly the support piece to the actual slider. It's not going to get welded to the frame just yet. We need to take this off and paint it. We also need to notch this section here in the pinch weld so that the support pieces don't dig into the body there. Here's the middle piece going to the frame, and you can see I've clocked them kind of at the bottom of the mounting plates. And that is because we're going to be placing a gusset on the upper part here to give it more rigidity and hopefully prevent deflection when we're resting on rocks or bouncing off of them. Now we can take this whole piece off, grind off the welds, paint it, and then mock it back up to weld to the frame. So we finished welding up all of the support pieces going to the frame. We've ground down all of the spatter, and now we are ready for paint. So hopefully this didn't contort or deflect too much from the heat of the welding, and everything lines up. We're gonna throw this on the floor, throw some bed liner on it, and then mock it up to weld onto the frame. Two paints of coat later, and it is fully coated and ready to mock up on the jack stands and then weld to the support brackets. We've also just made little cuts on the pinch weld and then used a hammer in order to knock them back so that we have the added clearance for the mounting tubing going from the slider to the frame. Now we've got the slider set into place. We've got the mounting tubes mounted up to the mounting plates, and we are ready to start welding. I'm also going to be adding these 1/4-inch gusset plates that I've cut in triangular pattern to add extra rigidity to the sliders. Gussets are all welded in, and we've added a coat of bed liner to all of these supporting pieces. Could have taken a flap disc and ground away some more of the speckles, but it's hard to get up in here. It's hard to weld in here, let alone try and get a flap disc up in there, but it's on. And they are plenty strong. All right, so the sliders are fully welded to the frame. We have support, and I think the hardest part of this whole endeavor, I mean, it is very labor intensive, obviously, but the hardest part is figuring out the curves of this 80 series frame. But we did it. It took some time, but we have what we need, which is support when we're resting it on rocks. And you can do this whole job with a Harbor Freight tube bender and some 120 wall Dom tubing or whatever tubing you select. And even just make a little kick out hoop here to deflect you off rocks and to push the rear end that way. So super stoked with the way that turned out. I've done this before on the white 80 series, so I did have a little bit of experience. And you'll go through some pieces, you'll mess up, but I think it's totally worth it. And again, you want to be able to protect your rocker panels, and these are cheap insurance to protect the body lines on an old vehicle, which get very expensive when you go to the body shop. This side actually pokes out a little bit further, which is what I wanted compared to the other side, but we're fine. If you have a stock 80 series Land Cruiser, this section here, you're going to have to bend it around your cats. Things that this is a Cummins swapped and the exhaust is ran in the frame. I don't really have to worry about it. So, well guys, there you have it. That's how you make rock sliders for any type of vehicle. We did 68-inch length on the sides here, and that's going to protect the entire rocker panel. So you can take whatever measurements you need in order to make rock sliders for yourself. But I had a really fun time doing this, and if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. We'll see you in the next one.